They mocked her at the range. They saw the quiet woman from logistics, the one who filed transport manifests with the same placid expression she wore now, and they smirked. The heat of the desert air warped the view downrange, making the distant targets shimmer like malevolent ghosts. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, dust, and condescension. She was an afterthought, a bureaucratic necessity forced to qualify alongside soldiers who lived and breathed their rifles. The real test, the one that truly mattered, was coming. A challenge born from their derision would force a revelation, and they would see not a clerk, but a weapon honed to an impossible edge. They just didn't know it yet. Her name was Anya, and she had been at Firebase Kestrel for 3 weeks. Her transfer orders were thin, the details of her previous posting redacted into black bars of ink that spoke more than 1,000 words of commendation ever could. To Colonel Thorne, the base commander, she was a problem. Her file was a ghost, a collection of non-answers. She was listed as a specialist, yet her age suggested a career far longer than the rank implied. He assigned her to the S4 shop, burying her in the mundane world of supply requisitions and inventory control. It was a safe place for a mystery. He believed, quite firmly, in a universe where things had their proper place. Soldiers belonged in the field. Clerks belonged behind desks. Anya, with her quiet intensity and the unnerving stillness in her gray eyes, did not seem to belong anywhere. The firebase itself was a study in temporary permanence. HESCO barriers formed a perimeter against a landscape of rust-colored sand and rock that stretched to an indifferent horizon. The sun was a relentless hammer, beating down on the corrugated metal roofs of the barracks and the shimmering hoods of tactical vehicles. Anya learned the rhythm of the place not through briefings, but through observation. She saw the subtle sag in the western fence line, a potential ingress point. She noted the predictable patterns of the perimeter patrols, the way the guards in Tower 3 always faced north after midnight, their attention drawn by the distant, faint glow of a civilian settlement. She saw the stress in the faces of the young soldiers, the forced bravado that barely concealed their fear. She saw the wear on their equipment, the dust-clogged rifle actions and the fraying straps of their body armor. She saw a system under strain, a place where routine had bred complacency. Her days were spent in a cramped, air-conditioned container that served as the logistics office. She processed requests for ammunition, water, and repair parts with a quiet efficiency that was both admirable and unsettling to her section chief, a portly master sergeant who preferred conversation to concentration. Anya did not converse. She worked. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a surgeon's precision. Her reports were flawless, her ledgers balanced to the last bullet. Yet her mind was always elsewhere. Through the grimy window of her office, she watched the soldiers train. She saw them practice room-clearing drills, their movements clumsy and loud. They bunched up at doorways, flagged each other with their muzzles, and communicated in shouts that would betray their position to anyone within 100 meters. She would trace the lines of their movements on the dusty glass, her mind re-choreographing their dance of simulated violence into something fluid, silent, and lethal. She wasn't judging them. She was calculating, assessing, filing away weaknesses like she filed ammunition requests. It was a habit she couldn't break, a relic from a life she was supposed to have left behind. The black bars in her file were not just redactions. They were tombstones. The mandatory quarterly range qualification was a welcome break for most of the base. It was a day to escape the confines of the wire, to make noise, to compete. For Anya, it was simply a requirement. She drew her M4 from the armory, the rifle feeling like a familiar extension of her own body. The armorer, a young corporal named Evans, gave her a dismissive look. "Careful with that, ma'am." Kix Anya said nothing. She simply field-stripped the weapon on the spot, her hands a blur of practiced motion. She checked the gas tube, the bolt carrier group, the firing pin. She cleaned out the fine layer of dust that had accumulated from simple storage, lubricated the key points with a single drop of oil, and reassembled it with an audible series of clicks that were as clean and precise as a surgeon's tools. Evans watched, his smirk faltering for a moment before he turned away to joke with his friend, Private Miller. "Guess the clerk knows one end from the other," The laughter that followed was easy and careless. Anya ignored it. The rifle was a tool. The opinions of others were just noise, and she had long ago learned to filter out noise. Colonel Thorne arrived at the range in a cloud of dust and authority. He stood on the observation platform, arms crossed, his gaze sweeping over the assembled soldiers. He was a man who believed discipline was forged in repetition and measured in tight shot groups. His eyes eventually found Anya, standing apart from the chattering groups of soldiers. He saw the clerk, out of place in her helmet and body armor. He saw a liability, a box to be checked on a readiness chart. His expression tightened. He had spoken to her only once, in a perfunctory welcome brief where he had laid down his expectations. "This is a forward operating base specialist," he had said, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "We are at the tip of the spear. We do not tolerate mediocrity. Your job is to ensure my soldiers have what they need to fight. Do you understand?" Anya had met his gaze without flinching. Crystal, sir, the single word, delivered with no deference and no attitude, had bothered him. It was too clean, too final. Now, seeing her on his range, that feeling of unease returned. He made a mental note to watch her performance. Mediocrity, after all, would not be tolerated. The first relay was called to the firing line. The soldiers shuffled forward, the gravel crunching under their boots. The range safety officer, a loud and theatrical sergeant, barked out the instructions for the qualification course. Prone, kneeling, standing. Slow fire, rapid fire. Magazine changes under pressure. It was a standard test designed to prove basic competence. Anya took her position at the far end of the line. She adjusted her sling, the worn nylon a familiar comfort. She closed her eyes for a brief second, not in prayer, but in preparation. She visualized the course of fire, the sight picture, the trigger press, the reset. She slowed her breathing, letting the rhythm of her own body push away the distractions of the wind and the whispers down the line. The mockery had begun in earnest now, low-pitched but audible. "I bet she hits the colonel's Humvee. 50 says she can't even load her own mag." Miller and Evans were the loudest, their youthful arrogance fueling the fire. Anya became a focal point for their boredom, a safe target for their casual cruelty. She let their words wash over her. They were children playing with toys they didn't fully understand. The RSO's voice boomed. "Shooters, lock and load." Anya seated her magazine with a firm tap, pulled the charging handle, and gently eased the bolt forward. She acquired her sight picture. The target, at 300 meters, wavered in the heat. To her, it was perfectly still. "Shooters, watch your lanes." The world narrowed to the front sight post, the target, and the space between. The commands, the jokes, the wind. It all faded into a dull, distant hum. There was only the mission. The RSO's final command was sharp and clear. "Fire!" The dismissal from Colonel Thorne had been polite, professional, and utterly complete. On her first day, he had summoned her to his office, a Spartan container distinguished from the others only by the flag hanging behind his desk and the slightly better air conditioner humming in the corner. He did not ask her to sit. He remained standing, holding the thin folder that contained her heavily censored life. "Specialist," he began, his voice flat. He didn't use her name. It was a subtle but effective way of establishing distance. "Your file is sparse." He dropped it onto his desk. The sound was a dull thud of finality. "It tells me where you completed basic training over a decade ago and not much else. The last 5 years are a complete blank." Anya stood at parade rest, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall just over his shoulder. She had known this was coming. The process of her reintegration into the conventional army was designed to be jarring. She was a ghost being forced back into the light, and ghosts made people uncomfortable. "I was attached to a special projects group, sir," she said, her voice even. It was the cover story she was ordered to use, vague and unverifiable. Thorne picked up a pen, tapping it against the desk. The rhythmic click was the only sound in the room for a long moment. It was a test of her composure. He was looking for a crack, a flicker of nervousness, anything that would give him a better read on the woman in front of him. He found nothing. Anya's stillness was absolute. Special projects, he repeated, the words dripping with skepticism. In my experience, special projects is a euphemism for things that either went very right or very, very wrong. Given that you're here in my S4 shop instead of at a medal ceremony, I have my guess as to which. His condescension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. He was baiting her, trying to provoke a reaction. Anya offered none. Her discipline was a shield, forged in crucibles he couldn't imagine. She had stood before men who held the power of life and death in a single word, and she had not flinched. A colonel in a dusty firebase was a minor annoyance. My job is to process supply requests, sir. I will do it to the best of my ability. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Your job is to do what you're told and to stay out of the way of my soldiers. The men and women on this base are warriors. They train for combat every single day. You are a support element, a functionary. You will keep your head down, you will push your papers, and you will not be a distraction. Is that clear? The insult was clear. He had reduced her to a piece of administrative machinery. He had looked at her and seen nothing of value beyond her ability to type. Crystal, sir, she said again, the same 2 words from their first encounter. The reply seemed to irk him even more this time. It was too economical, too devoid of the expected deference. He wanted her to be intimidated. She was merely present. He waved a hand in dismissal. That's all. Get to your section. Master Sergeant Reyes will get you settled. Anya executed a crisp about-face and walked out of the office. She didn't let her mask slip until she was back in the blinding sunlight. She took a deep breath, the superheated air searing her lungs. The dismissal stung, not because it was personal, but because it was symptomatic of the system she now found herself in. She had been a scalpel, a tool for precise, difficult work. Now she was a hammer in a world that only needed nails, and she had been put on a shelf. The mockery from the younger soldiers was a different flavor of dismissal, cruder but less impactful. They saw her gender first, her rank second, and her quiet nature as a weakness. They nicknamed her the Ghost, not out of respect for any stealthy ability, but because she was pale, quiet, and seemed to haunt the edges of their world without ever truly participating in it. Corporal Evans and Private Miller were the primary architects of this narrative. They were young, barely out of their teens, and saw the world in simple terms. Strong and weak, loud and quiet, predator and prey. Anya, to them, was firmly in the latter categories. They saw her in the chow hall, eating alone, her focus entirely on her meal. They saw her walking to her office, her stride measured and her gaze distant. They never saw her laugh, never heard her joke. They interpreted her silence as timidity, her solitude as a sign of social ineptitude. They couldn't comprehend that her silence was a weapon and her solitude a choice. They mistook discipline for fear. It was a common mistake and one she had seen get men killed. Even Master Sergeant Reyes, her direct supervisor, treated her with a kind of gentle condescension. He was a good man, a career soldier nearing retirement, but he saw Anya as someone who needed protecting. He would give her the easiest tasks, double-check her work unnecessarily, and speak to her in a slow, deliberate tone as if she might not understand the complexities of a fuel request form. Now, Anya, make sure you cross-reference the unit number with the daily allocation sheet, he would say, pointing at the screen with a thick finger. It can get tricky. Anya would simply nod. Understood, Master Sergeant. She could have automated his entire workflow with a few simple macros and redesigned his inventory system to be 3 times more efficient in a single afternoon. But that would draw attention, and her primary mission now was to be invisible. So she did the work as assigned, at the pace expected, and endured the well-intentioned but grating oversimplifications. She was a ghost, a functionary, a clerk. It was the role she had been given, and she would play it perfectly. But every evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she would stand outside her small quarters and watch the shadows lengthen. She would feel the shift in the wind, listen to the distant sounds of the desert, and remember who she was before the black ink had tried to erase her. The colonel, the corporals, the sergeants, they all saw what they wanted to see. Soon they would all see what she was. In the days following her meeting with Colonel Thorne, Anya settled into a routine of meticulous observation. Her job in the S4 container provided the perfect cover. It was a nexus of information, a place where the lifeblood of the firebase, fuel, water, ammunition, food, was quantified and distributed. To everyone else, it was paperwork. To Anya, it was a living schematic of the base's operational capacity and its vulnerabilities. She knew, for instance, that the generators on the north side of the perimeter consumed 20% more fuel than those on the south, indicating a maintenance issue no one had bothered to report. She knew the medical station was consistently under-ordering chest seals and tourniquets for the number of personnel on patrol, a critical oversight. She knew that Tower 4's night vision optics had been on backorder for 2 months, leaving a significant gap in surveillance during the darkest hours of the night. These were not her responsibilities, but information was ammunition, and Anya never discarded a useful round. Her observation extended beyond the data. From her window, she had a clear view of the motor pool and the primary training grounds. She committed the entire layout of the base to memory, not as a collection of buildings, but as a tactical problem. She mentally mapped fields of fire from every rooftop. She identified every piece of viable cover and concealment. She noted the choke points, the dead spaces in the camera coverage, the places where an attacker could move unseen. Her mind, conditioned by years of infiltration and exfiltration, automatically processed the environment, deconstructing it into angles, distances, and probabilities. She saw the world not as a place to live in, but as a space to be navigated and dominated. She studied the people with the same detached analysis. She learned to recognize individual soldiers not by their name tapes, but by their gaits. Corporal Evans had a swaggering, overconfident stride that shortened when he thought no one was watching. Private Miller walked with a slight shuffle, a sign of fatigue or poorly fitted boots. Colonel Thorne moved with an abrupt, rigid economy, his movements as sharp and angular as his personality. She watched them during their physical training in the mornings. She saw the ones who cut corners on their push-ups, the ones who had poor running form that would lead to injury, the ones who pushed their comrades to finish. She saw the subtle hierarchies of the squads, the natural leaders, the followers, the agitators. One afternoon, a simulated mass casualty drill was called. The alarm blared, and the base erupted into a state of controlled chaos. Medics ran with their kits, soldiers established a casualty collection point, and teams began practicing triage. From her window, Anya watched the exercise unfold. She saw 2 soldiers attempt to apply a tourniquet to a simulated leg wound. They placed it too low, below the injury, a mistake that would cost a real soldier his limb, if not his life. She saw them struggle to establish a security perimeter around the CCP, arguing over sectors of fire. The entire response was slow, disorganized, and loud. Anya felt a familiar, cold knot tighten in her stomach. It was the feeling she got when watching amateurs play a professional's game. She turned back to her computer and began typing, her fingers flying across the keys. She wasn't drafting a supply request. She was writing an after-action report in her head, a detailed critique of the drill's failures, complete with recommendations for improvement. It was a report no one would ever ask for and she would never submit. It was simply an exercise, a way to keep the blade sharp. Her focus was not limited to the base's deficiencies. She also identified its strengths. She saw a young lieutenant who managed his platoon with quiet confidence and earned respect. She saw a mechanic in the motor pool who could diagnose a faulty engine by sound alone. She saw the fierce loyalty the soldiers in a particular squad had for each other. These were assets, pieces on the board to be utilized. She filed them away just as she did the vulnerabilities. This constant, silent analysis was her new reality. It was how she stayed connected to the woman she used to be. The world of logistics was black and white, a matter of numbers and schedules. The world she had come from was 1,000 shades of gray, a world of instinct, intuition, and the split-second calculation of risk versus reward. By observing, she was bridging the two. She was a ghost haunting the machine, learning its every gear and piston, waiting for the moment it would inevitably break down. She didn't hope for it, but she knew, with the certainty of a meteorologist predicting a storm, that it was coming. Complacency was a seed that, once planted, always bore fruit. And on Firebase Kestrel, the harvest was overdue. The day of the range qualification arrived, bringing with it a palpable sense of pressure, though not the kind Anya was used to. It wasn't the life-or-death pressure of a ticking clock or an enemy patrol. It was the suffocating, petty pressure of social expectation and masculine pride. The range was a stage, and for the soldiers of Firebase Kestrel, it was a place to perform. The air hummed with boasts and challenges. Shot groups were compared, marksmanship badges were polished, and stories of impossible shots made in training were retold with increasing embellishment. Anya stood apart from it all, a silent observer in the midst of the clamor. Her presence on the line acted as a strange catalyst. The soldiers, led by the boisterous Corporal Evans, seemed to amplify their bravado in her direction, as if her quiet demeanor were a personal challenge to their identity as warriors. "All right, listen up," shouted Sergeant Croft, the range safety officer. He was a barrel-chested man whose voice seemed to have one volume. Loud. "Standard qual today, ladies and gents. You know the drill. You fail to qualify, you get to spend your weekend cleaning weapons with me. And trust me, you don't want that." A wave of groans and nervous laughter rippled through the ranks. Anya simply checked the seating of her magazine and adjusted her helmet. The pressure on the others was to perform for their peers and avoid punishment. For Anya, the only pressure was internal. The demand for perfection she placed on herself in any task, whether it was filing a form or firing a rifle. As they moved to the firing line, Evans fell into step beside her. "Nervous, specialist?" he asked, his tone a mix of feigned concern and open mockery. Miller snickered behind him. Anya didn't look at him. "No," she said, her voice flat. Her lack of engagement seemed to spur him on. "Don't worry, it's easy. Just point it that way," he said, gesturing vaguely downrange. "And try not to shoot the moon." The small group around them chuckled. They saw her as the designated target of their humor, the outsider who didn't fit. They were a pack, and she was the lone wolf, an object of suspicion and ridicule. Colonel Thorne watched from the observation tower, binoculars to his eyes. He scanned the firing line, his gaze lingering on Anya. He saw the cluster of soldiers around her, saw the smirks and the theatrical gestures. He disapproved of the unprofessionalism, but he did nothing to stop it. He wanted to see how she would react. Would she crumble? Complain? A soldier's character, he believed, was revealed under pressure. He expected her to shoot poorly, to confirm his assessment of her as a misplaced administrator. He was ready to see his judgment validated. The first course of fire was at 100 meters, from the prone position. It was the easiest part of the qualification. The command was given. The range erupted in a cacophony of sharp cracks. Anya settled into her position, her body low and stable against the ground. She controlled her breathing, firing in the natural respiratory pause. Her movements were fluid, economical. Fire, eject, load, fire. Each trigger press was deliberate, each recoil managed. While others sent rounds downrange in a hurried flurry, she worked with a calm, methodical rhythm. When the command to cease fire was given, the soldiers began chattering again, comparing notes, bragging about their hits. Anya remained silent, her eyes still downrange. The targets were brought in for scoring. A collective murmur went through the group as Anya's was displayed. 10 rounds, all neatly clustered in a single, ragged hole in the center of the bullseye. It was a perfect score. Evans stared at it, his jaw slack. Miller whistled low. Damn. Lucky shots, the excuse was flimsy, but it was enough for them to hold onto their preconceived notions. Sergeant Croft looked at the target, then at Anya, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He marked her score on his clipboard without comment. Thorne, watching through his binoculars, lowered them slowly. It was an impressive group, no doubt. But prone at 100 meters was simple. He remained unconvinced. The pressure mounted as they moved back to 200, then 300 meters, transitioning from prone to kneeling to standing. The targets grew smaller, the wind became more of a factor, and the comfortable stability of the prone position was gone. The other shooters' groups began to spread out. Misses became more common. The casual boasting subsided, replaced by the grunts and curses of concentration. Yet Anya's performance remained unchanged. Her kneeling position was as steady as a concrete pillar. Her offhand standing position was a masterclass in balance and bone support. Each shot was a mirror of the last. Her scores remained perfect. The mockery had evaporated, replaced by a tense, bewildered silence. They were no longer laughing at the clerk. They were watching a machine. The final course of fire was a timed, stress-based drill involving magazine changes and shifting between multiple targets. This was where most soldiers struggled, where the pressure to be fast caused fumbles and flyers. Anya moved through it with an unhurried grace that seemed to bend time. Her magazine changes were a blur, a single, fluid motion of hand to pouch to weapon to bolt release. She transitioned between targets not by jerking the rifle, but by moving her entire body as a single, integrated unit. The pings of her rounds hitting the steel targets were so rhythmically spaced they sounded like a metronome. When she finished, she lowered her rifle, conducted a chamber check, and placed the weapon on safe, all before some of the others had even emptied their first magazine. The range was quiet. The only sound was the wind and the distant hum of the base generators. Evans and Miller stared at her, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. They had mocked her, and she had responded with a display of marksmanship that none of them, not even the platoon's designated marksman, could hope to match. The social pressure had backfired spectacularly. Instead of making her crack, it had only served to put her skill on public display. And now a new kind of pressure was building. It was the pressure of an unexplained phenomenon. Who was this woman? Where did she come from? The questions hung in the dusty air, unspoken but felt by everyone. Most of all by the man standing on the tower, who was beginning to realize that the biggest mystery on his base wasn't a logistical problem, but the quiet woman holding the rifle. Anya finished cleaning her weapon, her movements precise and economical. She broke it down, wiped away the carbon and grit, applied a thin coat of lubricant, and reassembled it. She worked in a small bubble of silence, the other soldiers giving her a wide berth. The atmosphere on the range had curdled from boisterous mockery to a thick, uncomfortable awe. Her perfect score, a feat rarely seen even among seasoned infantrymen, had shattered their perception of her. She was no longer the clerk, she was an anomaly. Sergeant Croft walked over, his clipboard in hand. He looked at Anya, then at her rifle, then back at her. "Specialist," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier booming confidence. "That was exemplary shooting." Anya simply nodded, her expression unreadable. "Thank you, Sergeant." It was Evans, goaded by a mixture of shame and disbelief, who broke the spell. He walked up to the sergeant, his voice louder than necessary. "Exemplary? It was a fluke. Nobody shoots like that." Not consistently, he turned to Anya. His eyes narrowed in a direct challenge. "I bet you can't do it again," the other soldiers murmured in agreement. It was easier to believe in a lucky streak than to accept that a logistics specialist they had been ridiculing was fundamentally better than them at their own job. Anya looked at Evans. For the first time, her gaze held a spark of something other than placid indifference. It wasn't anger. It was something colder, more analytical. She saw his insecurity, his wounded pride. She saw an opportunity, not to humiliate him further, but to end the questions for good. She turned to Sergeant Croft. "I can do it again," she said, her voice quiet but carrying across the suddenly silent range. "But I have a condition." Croft raised an eyebrow. "What condition?" "I'll do it blindfolded." A stunned silence fell over the range. Even Colonel Thorne, who had been descending the steps of the tower, stopped dead. He stared at Anya, certain he had misheard. Blindfolded? It was impossible. It was a circus trick, a piece of theatrical nonsense. Miller let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. "She's crazy." Evans just stared, his challenge having been met and raised to an absurd degree. He couldn't back down now. "Fine," he stammered. Blindfolded. Sergeant Croft looked to the colonel for guidance. Thorne gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He wanted to see this. He needed to see it. This was no longer about qualification. It was about understanding the woman who stood before him. Anya walked back to the firing line. She took a clean, black cloth from her pocket, a rag she normally used for cleaning optics, and handed it to Croft. "Tie it yourself, Sergeant," she said. "Make sure it's tight." Croft, his face a mask of professional skepticism, took the rag. He wrapped it securely around Anya's head, covering her eyes completely. He checked it from the sides, ensuring there were no gaps. "Can you see anything?" he asked, his voice low. "No, Sergeant," Anya replied. She stood at the line, facing downrange, her world now a void of blackness. She held the rifle at a low ready. The sounds of the range became hyper-acute. The whisper of the wind, the crunch of gravel under Croft's boots as he stepped back, the nervous breathing of the soldiers watching her. She didn't need her eyes. She had mapped this world already. She knew the distance. She knew the weapon. She extended the rifle, her movements slow and deliberate. Her body was the firing platform. She locked her elbows, settled her feet, and became a statue. She raised the weapon, the stock finding the familiar pocket of her shoulder. She wasn't aiming with her eyes. She was aiming with her entire being. Her memory of the sight picture was perfect. Her understanding of her body's natural point of aim was absolute. She took a deep breath, held it, and listened. She felt the slight pressure of the wind on her left cheek. A 3-mile-per-hour crosswind, from left to right. She adjusted her hold, a minute, almost invisible shift to the left. A compensation of inches that would mean feet at 300 meters. "Load 1 magazine, 10 rounds," Croft commanded, his voice tight. "On my command, fire at will at the center target." Anya's hands found her pouch and her magazine by touch alone. She loaded the weapon with the same fluid efficiency as before. The sound of the bolt sliding home was unnaturally loud in the silence. She was ready. The soldiers held their breath. This was either going to be a spectacular failure or something they would tell stories about for the rest of their lives. "Fire!" Croft yelled. Anya's first shot broke the tension. The crack of the rifle was followed, a second later, by a faint but distinct ping as the round struck the steel target downrange. A collective gasp went through the crowd. She fired again. Ping. And again. Ping. A slow, steady rhythm. Crack ping. Crack ping. She was a human metronome of lethality. She wasn't just hitting the target. She was hitting the 10-inch center plate, over and over. She didn't rush. She paused between shots, seeming to listen to the world around her before sending the next round. She fired her 10th and final shot. Ping. She lowered her weapon, cleared it, and placed it on the ground. She stood perfectly still, the black blindfold a stark contrast to her pale face, waiting. For a long moment no one moved, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind, which seemed to hold its breath with the rest of them. Then, Colonel Thorne's voice cut through the silence, hard as iron. "Sergeant," he commanded, "take me down range. I want to see that target myself." The shift was as immediate and profound as a change in barometric pressure before a storm. The mockery was gone, incinerated by the impossible display they had just witnessed. The whispers that replaced it were no longer derisive but filled with a raw, fearful respect. As Colonel Thorne and Sergeant Croft drove the Humvee downrange, the soldiers stood in stunned clusters, their eyes fixed on Anya, who remained at the firing line. She had removed the blindfold and was calmly packing her gear, her movements as deliberate as ever. She betrayed no sign of triumph, no hint of "I told you so." Her intervention had been a statement of fact, not an act of pride. Evans and Miller stood together, their faces pale. The casual cruelty they had directed at her now felt like a grave sin. They had taunted a god, and she had answered with a quiet miracle. "How?" Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. "How is that possible?" Evans just shook his head, unable to form words. He had seen trick shooters at county fairs, but this was different. This wasn't a trick. It was a level of skill so far beyond his comprehension that it felt like a different species of existence. He felt a profound sense of shame, not just for his words, but for his own inadequacy. He had defined his worth by his proficiency with a rifle, and this quiet woman from logistics had just shown him that he was an amateur. When the Humvee returned, Colonel Thorne got out and walked directly toward Anya. He held the steel target plate in his hand. 10 rounds were clustered in a group no larger than his fist dead center. He stopped in front of her, holding it up for the others to see. No one needed to. They had heard the evidence, 10 distinct pings of vindication. Thorne looked at the target, then at Anya's face. He was searching for something. A hint of arrogance, a flicker of satisfaction. He found only a calm, waiting stillness. His mind was racing, reevaluating everything he thought he knew about her. The sparse file, the special projects, the impossible skill. She was not a clerk. She was something else entirely, something that had been hidden in plain sight. "Where did you learn to shoot like that, specialist?" Thorne asked, his voice low and intense, meant for her alone. "I had good instructors, sir," Anya replied, her answer as vague and frustrating as her file. Thorne's jaw tightened. He was a man who demanded answers, who lived in a world of certainty and clear chains of command. Anya was an equation with too many variables. He put the target down. "Everyone pack it up. Back to the base." "Specialist." He locked eyes with her. "My office. Now." The walk back to the command post was a silent parade. The other soldiers made way for her, their eyes following her with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The social dynamics of the base had been irrevocably altered. She was no longer the ghost because she was invisible. She was the ghost because she was something inexplicable, something possibly dangerous. Back in his office, Thorne closed the door, shutting out the rest of the world. He motioned for her to stand at ease, a small but significant departure from their first meeting. He paced behind his desk, the target plate sitting on the corner like a piece of abstract art. "I'm going to ask you again," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "And I expect a better answer than good instructors. No one achieves that level of proficiency without a lifetime of dedicated, professional training. That was not the shooting of a logistics specialist. That was the shooting of a Tier 1 operator. So who are you?" Anya met his gaze. The shield of the quiet clerk was beginning to fall away, revealing the harder substance beneath. She couldn't tell him the truth, her orders on that were absolute. But she could give him a piece of it. "I was in a unit that placed a high value on marksmanship, Colonel." "What unit?" he pressed. "It was a special projects group," she repeated the official lie. Thorne slammed his hand on the desk. The sound made the pens on his desk jump. "Do not play games with me. I have a right to know the capabilities of every soldier under my command. What you did out there, that's a capability. That's a weapon. And right now, it's an unknown weapon sitting in my armory. I don't like unknowns." His frustration was boiling over. He was a man in control, and Anya was a walking, breathing, impossibly accurate challenge to that control. Curiosity had replaced his dismissal. He was no longer trying to categorize her. He was trying to understand her. He had seen proof of her skill. Now he needed to know the story behind it. The base's perception of her had shifted from mockery to respect. His had shifted from suspicion to a deep, unsettling need to know more. And he was not a man who let a question go unanswered. The second test came less than 48 hours later, delivered by the indifferent fury of the desert itself. The sky, which had been a placid, washed-out blue, turned a sickly yellow-brown. The wind began to howl, picking up sand and dust until the horizon disappeared and the world shrank to a few hundred feet of swirling grit. It was a haboob, a sandstorm of blinding intensity. It descended on Firebase Kestrel like a shroud, reducing visibility to near zero and filling the air with a choking, abrasive dust that found its way into everything. Engines, weapons, and lungs. Within minutes, long-range radio communications devolved into a hiss of impenetrable static. The base was an island in a sea of sand. It was then that the report came in over the short-range net from the command post. Patrol Alpha, a four-man reconnaissance team, had missed their scheduled check-in. Their last known position was in a treacherous series of canyons 10 kilometers to the northeast, an area already known for spotty communications even on a clear day. Now, in the storm, it was a black hole. Panic, though professionally suppressed, was a palpable current in the Tactical Operations Center. The standard procedure was to wait for the storm to pass. Sending a rescue party out blind was incredibly risky. They could get lost, wander into an unmarked minefield, or stumble into the same trouble that had befallen Patrol Alpha. Colonel Thorne stood before the massive map on the wall, his face a grim mask. He was caught between two terrible choices: risk more lives on a guess, or adhere to protocol and potentially condemn 4 of his men. The radio operator tried again and again to raise the patrol. Alpha Victor 6, this is Kestrel Actual, how copy? Over, the only reply was the roaring static of the storm. The minutes stretched into an hour. The mood in the TOC grew heavier with every passing second. The young lieutenant in charge of the missing patrol stood by the map, his face ashen. The pressure was immense. Thorne knew he had to make a decision. It was in this moment of tense indecision that Anya appeared. She entered the TOC so quietly that no one noticed her at first. She hadn't been summoned. She had simply come. She stood near the back of the room, her eyes on the map, her expression as calm as if she were analyzing a shipping manifest. She listened to the frantic crosstalk, absorbed the data, and processed the problem. After several minutes of silent observation, she moved forward. She didn't address the colonel directly at first. She walked to the map and placed a single, steady finger on a spot several kilometers west of the patrol's last known position. "Sir," she said, her voice cutting through the tense chatter. Thorne turned, surprised to see her there. "What is it, Specialist?" "Standard infiltration routes are compromised by the storm," she stated, not as an opinion, but as a fact. "Visibility is 0. GPS is unreliable. A vehicle-mounted team will get lost or stuck. A dismounted team moving along the valley floor will be deafened by the wind." Easily ambushed, she traced a line on the map with her finger, a path that avoided the canyons entirely and instead followed a high, winding ridgeline. But the ridgeline offers advantages. The wind will be fiercer, but it will also scour the ground, making it easier to spot fresh tracks. The sound of the storm will be consistent up there, without the echoes of the canyon, making it easier to isolate an unnatural noise, like gunfire. And from this point, her finger stopped on a high peak. You can get line of sight to the patrol's LKP. Even with the dust, a thermal imager might pick up a heat signature. Thorne stared at the map. The route she proposed was insane. It was longer, more exposed, and required a level of navigational skill that was almost superhuman in these conditions. "No one can navigate that ridge in this storm," he said, dismissing the idea. "They'd walk right off a cliff." "I can," Anya said. The two words hung in the air. A simple, declarative statement, devoid of arrogance. It was a statement of capability. The memory of the blindfolded shooting flashed in Thorne's mind. He had seen her do the impossible once already. He looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing not the clerk but the calm, confident operator who had been hiding beneath the surface. He saw the cold, analytical mind that had deconstructed his range into a simple math problem now deconstructing the storm into a tactical opportunity. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward was 4 of his men's lives. He was being presented with a third option, a high-stakes gamble offered by the biggest enigma on his base. "You'd go alone?" he asked. "It's a one-person job, sir," she replied. "A team is too slow and makes too much noise. Give me a rifle, a thermal scope, and a radio with a directional antenna. I'll locate the patrol, assess the situation, and report back. Strict reconnaissance. No engagement unless compromised." The men in the TOC stared at her, then at the colonel, waiting for his decision. The fate of the missing patrol now rested on whether he could trust the woman he had so thoroughly dismissed just days before. He thought of the perfect shot group, the impossible calm under pressure. He had wanted to know her capabilities. She was showing them to him now. He made his choice. "Get her what she needs," Thorne ordered, his voice ringing with newfound authority. "And find me 2 volunteers to provide overwatch from the perimeter. She's not going out there completely alone." Instantly, 2 voices spoke up from the back of the room. "We'll go, sir." It was Evans and Miller. Their faces were grim, determined. The guilt from their mockery had been replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. They had witnessed her skill, and now they were volunteering to be part of the solution she offered. Thorne nodded. "Gear up. You have 5 minutes." The second test had begun. It was no longer about hitting a steel plate. It was about bringing 4 men home from a storm that could swallow them whole. As Anya and her 2 newly minted volunteers prepared to leave, Colonel Thorne returned to the quiet solitude of his office. The operational chaos of the TOC faded behind him, replaced by the hum of his air conditioner and the insistent thrum of a single, burning question. Who was Anya? The display at the range had been an anomaly. Her calm, tactical breakdown of the rescue problem was something else entirely. It was the product of elite training and extensive field experience. His gut, an instrument honed by 30 years of service, told him that the story of her past was far deeper and darker than the sanitized version in her file. He sat at his desk, the redacted folder in front of him. It was a dead end, but there were other avenues. He activated his secure terminal, the screen glowing green in the dim light. He had a contact at Intelligence and Security Command, an old friend from his days at the War College, a man who owed him more than one favor. Accessing the encrypted communication link, he placed the call. The face of a grizzled, tired-looking general appeared on the screen. "Marcus," the general said, his voice a low gravel. "This better be important. The storm has knocked out half our comms on this side of the globe." "It is, Jim," Thorne replied, getting straight to the point. "I need you to run a service number for me. High priority. I need the unredacted file." He read Anya's service number into the encrypted microphone. On the other end of the line, the general's weary expression sharpened. He typed the numbers into his own terminal. He was silent for a long time, his eyes scanning whatever information had appeared on his screen. The color seemed to drain from his face. "Marcus," he said, his voice suddenly cold and formal. "I'm going to pretend you didn't ask me that. For your own good, you need to drop this. Forget that number exists." The warning only strengthened Thorne's resolve. "I can't do that, Jim. The soldier assigned to that number is on my base. I just sent her out into a sandstorm to find 4 of my missing men. I need to know who I'm dealing with." The general sighed, a heavy, world-weary sound. He looked away from the camera, as if consulting with someone unseen. When he looked back, his face was set like stone. "What I'm about to tell you does not leave this room. It is not to be written down. It is not to be repeated. If anyone asks, this conversation never happened. Do you understand?" "Crystal," Thorne said, the word tasting like irony on his tongue. The general took a deep breath. "There is no official file on Specialist Anya Volkov. Not anymore. The one you have is a fabrication, a legend created to give a ghost a place to rest. Her real service record is sealed under a program designation so classified that most of the Joint Chiefs don't have clearance for it. She's not a logistics specialist, Marcus. She was the operational commander of a unit called Task Force Chimera." Thorne had never heard of it. "They were a Black Ops unit," the general continued, "specializing in deep cover operations, targeted assassination, and unconventional warfare. They didn't officially exist. They were deniable assets sent to places we were never supposed to be, to do things we could never admit to doing. They were the sharpest part of the spear." The general paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Volkov wasn't just a member. She was their leader in the field. Her call sign was Spectre. They said she could read a battlefield like a book, that she could anticipate enemy movements before they happened. The stories about her are the stuff of legend in the circles that know. "What happened to her?" Thorne asked, his voice barely a whisper. "The Odessa incident," the general said, the name itself seeming to leave a bad taste in his mouth. "About a year ago." The mission went sideways. Details are non-existent, but the official report lists the entire task force, including Spectre, as killed in action. She was declared dead. Marcus. Her file was scrubbed, her existence erased. She's supposed to be a ghost. Thorne felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The quiet clerk, the woman he had dismissed and belittled, was a ghost. A living legend, presumed dead, who had been hidden on his base as a logistics specialist. Why? Thorne asked. Why hide her here? I can only guess, the general said. Someone powerful wanted her off the board but alive. Maybe she saw something she wasn't supposed to. Maybe the things she did finally broke her. Or maybe they're just waiting for the right time to use her again. Whatever the reason, you need to be careful. You don't have a soldier, Marcus. You have a loaded weapon with the safety off. Don't do anything to make it go off. The line went dead. Thorne sat back in his chair, the silence of his office pressing in on him. He looked at the map on his wall, at the treacherous ridgeline now being navigated by a woman who wasn't supposed to exist. He had sent a ghost into the storm, and he understood with a sudden, chilling clarity that the storm was the least of the dangers out there. The true force of nature was the woman walking into it. The revelation was complete. He now knew who she was. The question was, what was he going to do about it? The storm was a physical assault. The wind screamed, tearing at Anya's gear, and the sand blasted every exposed surface of her skin. For Evans and Miller, hunkered down at the edge of the base perimeter with a long-range thermal scope, it was a battle just to stay upright. For Anya, it was a familiar environment. She moved through the chaos not by fighting it, but by flowing with it. She kept low, using the contours of the land for protection, her steps sure and steady. She wasn't navigating by sight, but by a combination of compass, pace count, and an intimate, instinctual feel for the terrain that no map could provide. She was a phantom in the maelstrom. An hour into her trek, her training took over completely. Her mind became a cold, clear instrument of calculation. The wind became a source of information, its changing direction telling her about the topography ahead. The grit under her boots told her if she was on rock or loose sand. She was utterly alone, yet completely in her element. Reaching the high ground she had identified on the map, she unslung her rifle and activated the thermal scope. She swept the canyon below, the world appearing to her in ghostly shades of white and gray. The storm made it difficult, creating false heat signatures from sun-baked rocks. But Anya was patient. She scanned the area methodically, quadrant by quadrant. Then she saw it. For distinct heat signatures, clustered behind a rock outcropping. They were stationary, too stationary. And 100 meters away, on the opposing canyon wall, she saw another. A single signature, tucked into a sniper's hide. She keyed her radio using a short-range, directional burst to minimize the chance of interception. Kestrel Actual, this is Spectre. I have eyes on Alpha. For friendlies, pinned down. I have one hostile sniper, observing their position. He's waiting for them to break cover. Advise, Thorne's voice came back, strained through the static. Spectre, your orders are strict recon. Do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. Report position and I'll send a QRF when the storm breaks. Anya looked through her scope. One of the friendly heat signatures flickered. A man was wounded. They didn't have time to wait for the storm to break. The sniper was patient. He could wait them out. If they stayed, the wounded man might die. If they moved, the sniper would kill them all. Actual, waiting is not an option, she sent back, her voice calm but firm. The hostile is in a fortified position. A QRF will be channeled into his kill zone. I have a solution. There was a long pause on the other end. Thorne was at a crossroads. His orders, his protocol, his entire command philosophy screamed for him to pull her back. But the general's words echoed in his mind. She was the sharpest part of the spear. He was holding a scalpel and his men needed surgery. Proceed, Spectre, he finally said. The use of her old call sign an acknowledgement of who she truly was. Proceed with extreme caution. Anya didn't need to be told. She slung her rifle and began to move, not away from the sniper, but parallel to him, using the storm as a moving curtain. She descended from the ridge, her movements silent and fluid. She entered the canyon a kilometer down from the sniper's perch and began to work her way up, staying in the dead ground at the base of the cliff. The wind howled in the narrow space, deafening her, but it also masked her own sounds. She was a ghost moving through a violent world. It took her another hour of painstaking, muscle-burning climbing to get into position. She was now directly below the sniper's hide, separated by 30 feet of sheer, crumbling rock face. She could hear small pebbles skittering down, dislodged by the man above her. She didn't use her rifle. At this range, in this wind, it was too uncertain. She holstered her pistol and drew her combat knife. She began to climb, finding handholds and footholds that were barely there, testing each one before putting her weight on it. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the movements of a predator. As she neared the ledge, she paused, controlling her breathing, letting the adrenaline sharpen her senses. She could hear the sniper now, a faint, rhythmic sound. He was humming to himself, bored and confident in his position. Anya pulled herself over the ledge in a single, silent motion. The sniper was focused on his scope. His world narrowed to the men trapped across the canyon. He never knew she was there. There were no wasted movements, just a swift, brutal efficiency. The threat was neutralized. She took the sniper's radio. She keyed the frequency she had overheard him using. "All clear," she said in flawless, unaccented Pashto. Moving to secondary position, she then crept back down the rock face and made her way to the trapped patrol. They saw a figure emerge from the swirling sand, rifle at the ready, and nearly opened fire before they recognized her profile. Their relief was overwhelming. The wounded man was fading. Anya applied a new tourniquet, high and tight, and administered a saline lock. She got them on their feet and led them back the way she had come, taking a long, safe route out of the canyon. They stumbled back onto the base just as the first rays of sun broke through the dissipating storm. The entire command staff was there, waiting. Medics rushed forward to take the wounded soldier. The patrol leader, a young sergeant, stood before Colonel Thorne, exhausted but alive. "Sir," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. She saved us. She appeared out of nowhere. The sniper. He was just gone." Thorne's eyes weren't on the sergeant. They were on Anya. She stood apart, her face caked in dust, her expression calm. She had walked into an impossible situation and delivered a perfect result. She had not only followed his orders, she had exceeded them in a way he couldn't have imagined. He walked toward her, the rest of the base watching in silence. He stopped directly in front of her. He looked at the woman he had called a functionary, a clerk. He saw the ghost, the legend, the specter. Slowly, deliberately, Colonel Marcus Thorne raised his hand to his brow and rendered a sharp, perfect salute. It wasn't the salute of a commander to a subordinate. It was the salute of a soldier to a warrior. Behind him, Evans and Miller, their faces streaked with sand and relief, followed his lead. Then the young lieutenant. Then the master sergeant. One by one, the soldiers in the command post, the men who had mocked her, dismissed her, and misunderstood her, raised their hands in a silent collective gesture of profound and hard-earned respect. In the days that followed, a new kind of quiet settled around Anya. The whispers and stares didn't vanish, but their nature changed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a reverence that was almost as isolating. The soldiers of Firebase Kestrel no longer saw a clerk. They saw the woman who walked into a sandstorm and came back with their own. They gave her a wide berth, not out of fear, but out of an unspoken acknowledgement that she was something different, something more. They didn't understand what she was, but they knew enough to respect it. Colonel Thorne had officially reassigned her. Her new title was Base Tactical Advisor. It was a vague, custom-made position that gave her the authority to move and act as she saw fit. She was no longer shackled to a desk. She spent her days observing training, her quiet presence forcing the soldiers to a higher standard. She would offer a quiet word of correction to a soldier struggling with his marksmanship, a subtle adjustment to a fire team's formation, a suggestion for a more efficient way to clear a room. She never raised her voice, never demanded. She simply offered her expertise, and it was accepted as gospel. Evans and Miller became her shadows, eager to learn, to absorb any small piece of the knowledge she carried. They stopped seeing her as a mystery to be solved and started seeing her as a standard to which they could aspire. She had not sought a position of leadership, but it had been given to her nonetheless, earned not through rank, but through undeniable competence. Her relationship with Colonel Thorne also found a new equilibrium. He never spoke of the call to his general, never used the name Spectre again. He didn't need to. They now shared an unspoken understanding. He would consult her on patrol routes, on defensive postures, on intelligence reports. He treated her not as a subordinate, but as a trusted peer, a specialist whose counsel was invaluable. He had learned the hard way that the most dangerous weapon on his base wasn't a missile or a machine gun, but the quiet woman who saw the world in angles and probabilities. He had learned to trust the ghost in his machine. One morning, just before dawn, Anya walked out to the shooting range alone. The air was cool and still, the dust settled. The rising sun painted the eastern sky in hues of orange and purple. She didn't carry a target or a box of ammunition. She just carried her rifle. She walked to the 300-meter line, the place where it had all begun, and stood there, facing the distant steel plates that shimmered in the early light. She wasn't there to shoot. She was there to be still. She closed her eyes, the blindfold now just a memory, and felt the first gentle stirrings of the morning wind on her face. She held the rifle, its weight familiar and comforting in her hands. This was her truth. Not the files, not the legends, not the whispers or the salutes. Her truth was in the discipline, in the calm, in the perfect union of mind, body, and tool. She was not defined by what others thought of her, neither their scorn nor their respect. She was defined by her capabilities, by the quiet confidence that came from a lifetime of pushing past the limits of what was considered possible. She opened her eyes and watched the sun crest the horizon, flooding the desert with clean, new light. She was Anya. She was a soldier. And here, in the quiet solitude of the dawn, she was finally at peace. Her dignity was her own, her respect earned, her future an unwritten page. The silhouette of the lone woman on the range, standing sentinel as the world awoke, was the only truth that mattered.